Ms. Comeau, the floor is now yours. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to jump right into the presentation. I'm very happy to talk about the work of the Conservation Council and my own background on climate change during the question period. Next slide, please. Today I'm going to talk about some key messages in terms of New Brunswick's progress, how climate action is quickening in terms of pace, what some of the federal drivers are and the intensifying pressures globally, and recommendations in 3 categories: accountability and governance, reducing hazards and increasing preparedness, and creating an electrification strategy. We'll also talk about the need to engage citizens. Next slide, please. To prepare for today, I spent an enormous amount of time reviewing all our previous work and went back to the Select Committee report and looked at those recommendations to see what they were, where they went, and point out a couple of things for the committee. One is that it was an excellent report, all-party report, and that where recommendations did not make it into the climate plan or were ignored in sense of being left out, we need to deal with those now, and I see a number of those around electricity. The climate plan itself, as we all have heard, is an excellent plan, but of course we have to implement it. My observation there for you is that the pressure to implement the plan has been weakened by the perception that our greenhouse gas emission targets have been met, and that has undermined, I think, the need for strategic and long-term planning. It should also be pointed out that our per capita emissions are high. We're not that different than the average Canadian, even though our emissions overall have fallen. Next slide, please. So the pace of change on climate is quickening, and that's because there's a growing understanding of the global carbon budget. And I will be happy to talk about how that works in questions. But for now, could we just move to the next slide? I want to share with you a couple of reports, the first one from the United Nations Environment Program, and this explains a little bit about why pressure is increasing. First thing to note is that the carbon budget is shrinking and that every ton matters, including New Brunswick's. Every ton absolutely matters because we are soon to exceed the level of warming that would generate 1.5 degrees warming. The commitments we made up to COP26, which was in the UK, only take 7.5% off the emissions that we need to have gone by 2030. We need to be closer to 55% reductions globally. Next, please. So the pace of change is quickening, and I would suggest that it's advisable for government and the legislative committee to think about more pressure, if you will, driving us to think about deeper reduction targets. Canada's current target of 40 to 45% will not be, in my strong advice to you, not be the target Canada's dealing with in 2030. And that's because both global and national processes require reviews in 2023 and 2026. We should be likely at that point closer to 60% and of course on our way toward net zero with emissions being closer to near zero. Next slide, please. This is a busy slide, but it just will set up some of the conversation you'll have this afternoon with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. They did 2 reports last year that I think are instructive for us. The first one looked at what they called sink or swim, and they identified risks and opportunities and encouraged decision makers to think more about the competitive benefits of near-term action. They also pointed out, though, that some sectors are going to grow and others will decline in demand. And you can see at the top of the chart where the green arrow is showing that most of those sectors, low carbon power, fuel cells, those kinds of things, they relate to electricity. Declining demand will be for oil and gas in particular, and that includes refining. And of course, that's driven primarily by the electrification of transportation. Next slide, please. The Canadian Institute also did a net zero study for Canada, which was very helpful, I think. They used some framing that you'll hear from Dale about later today called safe bets or wildcards. And safe bets, they argue, will be what we need to do to get the emissions reductions we need by 2030. So more energy efficiency, shifting to non-emitting electricity, heat pumps and electric vehicles, for example. Other technologies that are not yet commercialized, like certain types of carbon capture and small modular nuclear reactors, they put in a category called wildcards. It's not that they can't make a contribution, but we don't know yet if they'll work. Next slide, please. So the past is not the future in terms of how we think about our response to certainly federal regulations, and I'll take you to the next slide, please. And here I would point out a few things for you to consider. I do a lot of work at the federal provincial interface, and New Brunswick needs to expect stronger federal regulations, similar to what you've seen with the federal decision on not extending New Brunswick the Belden equivalency agreement. But carbon pricing is also changing. There's a new set of rules. New Brunswick is not in compliance with those set of rules. We also will see a new clean fuel standard in 2022. And what's important to remember is that these regulations apply regardless of where New Brunswick is on its greenhouse gas target. Next slide, please. So I want to talk now about the three strategic opportunity categories. Accountability and governance is the first, and if we can go to the next slide, please. And I'll just cover some of the items that I think really we could call it day-to-day business of governing. I mean, these are things the government's going to have to deal with, that the update to the plan should deal with. So we do need to plan for a deeper target. We do need to commit to net zero. We need to understand that the governance is going to require more rigor in terms of performance metrics, applying a climate lens, and with the changes to the Municipal Act, we'd like to see a very quick release of the Statement of Interest on climate change. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the carbon pricing regime is going to change and revenue is going to change as a result of that. And of course, when we started this whole process, we committed to a climate fund where revenue would go. The Select Committee was pretty clear that they did not recommend money from the carbon price going into general revenue. But we have an opportunity going forward in terms of how we treat new revenue. And that should be used to expand investment in both mitigation, but obviously, as you've seen, adaptation. And we need to focus on securing deep retrofits, more than like 50% when you do a building or a home, as opposed to today, which is quite a bit less than that. And of course, transforming public transportation, transit and transportation. We need to have an application system so more of us can participate in the solutions. Next slide, please. We also need to be more transparent. I wanted to point out that under the climate plan, a number of studies have been produced, including on carbon neutral government and offsets and so on. None of those are public, and they should be. But that way, we all do a better job in our own work. And many studies are currently planned for under the most recent list of projects funded, and we should see those too. Thank you. Next slide, please. We definitely need to increase public engagement, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. But in the plan and recommended by Select Committee, we didn't really create the advisory committee, which we think would be helpful. We don't have a government-sponsored awareness program for climate change, and community groups through the Environmental Trust Fund just can't take that load. We also don't have multi-year funding. Next slide, please. So let's go now, just a quick summary for the next slide. Thank you. Summarizing what you've heard already, I just want to reinforce these incredibly important points from the adaptation groups, that we do need a risk assessment, hazard risk assessment for the province. We need an adaptation plan, that natural infrastructure can take us a long way, and just remind the committee of what Blair Feltmore said, that failure to do this will lead to more class action suits that government will have to deal with. Next slide, please. So this is my priority strategy, and that's an electrification story. And if you go to the next slide. So the reality is that demand for electricity is going to grow from electrification of transportation, industrial processes. We've seen some recent stories about Bitcoin. Some of the numbers are huge, like a doubling of the size of the electricity system or more. We do need to take heed of least cost analysis, which I look at a lot in terms of modeling. I work with a lot of engineers and economists, energy specialists. And every time we do some modeling work, nuclear, including small modular nuclear and fossil fuels, turn out to be less competitive with renewable energy efficiency and interconnections, as we'll likely talk about with the Atlantic Loop. So we need to explore those options for interconnection and more renewables. Next slide, please. And we need to think about one of the myths that we're often told, and that is that we can't afford it, that rates will go up if we transform the electricity system in New Brunswick. And that's simply not true if you do the programming right. International Energy Agency just put out a very important report just a few months ago, I guess, where they looked at net zero emissions and found that households could use up to 30% less energy as a result. Next slide, please. So let's talk about small modular nuclear reactors. I know that the government has put a lot of its political capital into this technology, and I wanted to share with you some thoughts because it is important when we make big decisions like this to think, to pay attention to many, many perspectives. There are legitimate questions, including that it's, of course, at a very research and early stage development. It's not yet commercial. And it may not work or be affordable, reminding ourselves that LaPro is half NB Power's debt. But the small modular nuclear roadmap had 3 kind of price points, if you will. And in all cases, they're higher than wind and so on. So we need to think about that. But we also need to think about timelines. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Organization does, even in their own documentation, say it's a minimum of 9 years. We also would be generating new waste, liquid nuclear waste, and we are not prepared for that. Public opinion also favors renewable energy, and there is a strong anti-nuclear sentiment among francophones. So our suggestion is to hedge your bets. Next slide, please. So what we're proposing is that the province update its Energy Policy and Electricity Act, that we can focus on low bills rather than low rates, that we can consider environment and social costs along with economic costs, and that as the electricity system grows, let's allow for a mix of public, private, and community-owned power. You heard from Denis Comeau from the port what they would like to do. You're going to hear from municipal utilities. Let's make room for everybody to be part of the solution. Next slide, please. So we're talking about amending our policies to better support energy efficiency. The climate plan talked about a specific amount of investment per year, and we haven't really achieved that. And of course, as Claudia told you last week, we do need to prepare for net zero buildings and adopting the building codes when they come out, and doing more for low-income retrofit programming, but also moderate income households. We need a stepped kind of grant program so that everyone can pursue deep retrofits. Next slide, please. On renewables, what we're talking about is a doubling of our current target to 2030. This is what Nova Scotia is doing. We can also improve our net metering program to be more fair. We can deliver the promised renewables under the locally owned renewable energy program, and we can do more to build smart communities like we see in Shediac. Next slide, please. So let's talk about Belden. Next slide, please. My suggestion is that we think about the Belden situation from through the perspective of strategy, as opposed to responding to what might be perceived as a crisis. If we have a strategy, we'll have a better understanding. Right now, there's lots of discussion about using wood pellets there. I've spent several weeks engaging with people and talking to them and asking experts to help me understand it, because that's what I do. I'm a researcher. And there are, of course, other options available, and we do need to think about all of them. Next slide, please. So here's just a few things to think about with respect to wood pellets. So the energy density is lower, which means you burn more than you would, say, for coal. When you're cutting, in terms of forestry, it can take 40 to 100 years for carbon debt from that cutting to be recovered. I can tell you that there's building pressure to not characterize pellets biomass as clean, and we could see that we need carbon capture in the future. But it's also inefficient. If we burn it to generate electricity, we get 35% efficiency instead of 85 to 90 if we burn it in buildings to provide heat. Next slide, please. Next slide. I want to talk to you just quickly about public opinion. We did a survey in June of over 900 people in the Atlantic. And if you show the next slide, please, I'll give you a sense of how citizens define clean electricity. You can see that primarily they think of clean electricity as solar, wind, and hydro. Nuclear isn't the item that comes to mind. And you'll see biomass is also lower, but francophones definitely are more comfortable with biomass. Next slide, please. We also asked citizens what kind of resources do they want powering their electricity system. And this is very interesting. They really do want to see renewables in the province first, and then we can connect to regional networks like to bring in more hydro. Next slide, please. We also wanted to understand if people perceived that nuclear is clean and emissions-free, which is how it's often described. And I try to always have a very balanced approach, and so we asked both sides, is clean and emissions-free, does it apply to nuclear because it doesn't have greenhouse gas emissions, or does it not apply because there are other environmental and social risks? And you can see 3/4 of the respondents clearly think it is not clean or emissions-free. Next slide, please. We also asked them about coal phase-out options, and again, renewables come to the fore, along with connecting to Quebec and Newfoundland to bring in hydro. Next slide, please. So here I just want to share with you a little bit, a couple of slides left, about what social scientists are saying about what I call the social determinants of success. Next slide, please. Because electrification is not only about policy, technology, and engineering, we need to engage the public. Research shows that if we do what we call performative consultation and move away from that to more participatory engagement, where stakeholders actually affect decisions. And in this case, I'm talking about things like siting, where a wind turbine could go, we get better outcomes. And certainly the siting concerns were a factor in the opposition to the Anse Bleue wind project. And the International Energy Agency really points this out to us, that energy transitions do not mean the end to large projects in terms of infrastructure, that we can face opposition from local communities, that we need ways to engage those concerned and assuage their concerns. A clear and engaged social debate on the case for change is vital. Next slide, please. So let me summarize the key points. The winds of change are blowing harder in terms of climate change, of course, but also in terms of political pressure. We need to think about systems change instead of reacting to individual federal regulations, for example, Belden. We need to balance the focus on SMRs with less costly near-term options to manage risks and take advantage of safe bets and lower household costs. And we need to bring citizens into the discussion, educate, engage, and listen. So in ordering the priorities, creating the electrification strategy, I'd say, is number one. The International Energy Agency just put out a review of Canada last week and called for Canada to have a national electrification strategy. We definitely need to be reducing hazards and increasing preparedness, and we do need stronger accountability and governance, especially on the operation of the Climate Fund using new carbon pricing revenue. Last slide, please. So just to share with the committee a few things, I listened attentively to all the presentations last week. And of course, whenever a question was asked and we didn't quite get the answer for you, I've gone and done some research. So if you have questions like on EVs or anything like that that I didn't talk about, please do. I've done some work for you on that. And please get in touch. I'm happy to talk to anyone anytime about our work. I've worked on climate change for more than 30 years as an educator, a researcher, and a campaigner, and I'm very happy to assist in any way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Comeau. We will now move into our question period. I would remind all members that you have 10 minutes to ask your questions. If you want to keep track of your time, then if you put your screen on gallery view, the clock will show up there. Donc, on va commencer avec l'opposition officielle. Je ne sais pas qui va commencer. Monsieur Legacy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Madame Comeau, for your presentation. I must admit there's a lot to unfurl there. It's a lot of slides in 20 minutes to take up, but I did pick up on a couple of points. First of all, I know you mentioned that because New Brunswick's achieved its target already, that maybe we're not pushing hard enough. What would you say, in your opinion, was the biggest items that came out for us to achieve those targets? What were the most mitigating factors?
Good question. I tried to calculate the contribution to our reductions from industrial restructuring. My calculation is about 60% of our reductions have come from plant closures. The rest is a mix of wind, efficiency, and so on. So it's not a perfect calculation. This is complicated. To go back in history would take a bit of forensic work, but it's the best that I could come up with the data that I have. It was covered in the 2017 Auditor General report. And in the back of the slide deck, I do include the table from the Auditor General's report. And it shows you by tons, and I'll show you which one it is. It says Auditor General 2017 closure effects. So I've got that there for you.
So essentially I guess it was more of a passive result than anything that was actually proactively done, about 60%.
It's, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Patrick, you can go back to a couple of more slides. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Legacy.
No problem.
There.
Okay, perfect. I'll have a look at that. And then on the energy efficiency side, we looked at last week. We achieved our maximum load again last week after years of working on trying to make ourselves more efficient. What's your view on how we're doing on that? Because is it just a matter of growth in the province, or are we just not achieving enough efficiency for the programs that we have?
So of course we're heating in winter with electricity, which is going to be an advantage to us as we move to renewable energy. But it is a big winter peak for heating. And NB Power does pursue demand response where it tries to shave those peaks. And we really do need to expand our efforts to invest in demand response. There's lots that we can do, and I know NB Power is paying attention to that. The second thing, though, is when we are doing retrofits, we're not doing deep retrofits. We go into a building, we go into a home, we might get maybe 10, 20% of improvement. We should be after 50% improvements in our retrofits. So both of those things, I think, are part of the solution, but I'm sure NB Power will have much more to tell you about that.
Okay. On Belden, obviously, it's in my region. I understand that we can't take it as a crisis mode, but you have to understand in our region with 8 years left, it does feel like a crisis mode for the workforce and for the community. And I just want to hear you talk more, because when I look in the slides, what I see is putting wind turbines in the Fundy and going to grab some electricity from Quebec for hydro. I don't really see how that would necessarily take care of our community or our workforce. And then you mentioned in your slide that we need to look at other options. What do you see for other options?
First thing to say is my family's from the area. I am paying attention to it. I've been to Belden. I've met with people in the plant. I've had many conversations, including with the mayor of Belden. So I really care, as you do, about what's going to happen. Very, 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 very supportive of what Denis Caron is doing at the port. There are real opportunities there. What if we expanded Caribou? What if we really looked at district energy? What if we drove pellets into really using them for heating and so on? There are opportunities. We should pursue them. And absolutely 100% CCMB wants to see economic development in the north as well as anywhere else when it comes to the transition. On wind, I will point out to you, you often hear NB Power say that when the wind doesn't blow in New Brunswick, it doesn't blow everywhere. I've spent weeks talking to meteorologists and researchers, and I've learned, of course, that that's not true. Our wind turbines are concentrated on the interior of New Brunswick, but in fact, we've got excellent potential with the Birch Hill wind project, as well as on the northern coast. We have the wind. We can do the investments. I'm very, very concerned that the two projects, Anse Bleu and Polkshaw, under the locally owned program that MB Power operates, that 40 megawatts did not proceed. We need to understand why, and we need to have a commitment from government to ensure that those projects get built. Absolutely, 100% really see this as an opportunity for the North.
Okay, thank you. One last question. There's quite a bit of talk on SMR, obviously, and we know that in New Brunswick there's two different projects. One's much closer to I guess economic viability or being, I guess, commercialized, I should say, and then one is around a little bit more on being researched, but there's a potential to go grab the nuclear waste and reuse it, recycle it, and you know, bring it back into the fore. And I understand it might take another 10 or 15 years to do this. Is it my understanding that what you're proposing is that we hedge our bets, but that you still see value in the potential of that? Because we already are in nuclear, and if we have that waste that's going to be 250,000 years to be stored, I don't see an extra 10 or 15 years of doing this valuable R&D and maybe being able to reduce that not being worthwhile. Can I get some comment on that?
Yes, so from a research point of view, sure, you know, let's do some research. But having it delay greenhouse gas reductions in the near term is not the best way to go. I'd also point out a couple of things, and this is why we need a discussion about it in New Brunswick. I do see a lot of wishful thinking and motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, because we're not opening the conversation to lots of different perspectives. So let's look at the plant that's supposedly based on the ARC system, or the ARC system's based on in Idaho. The committee needs to know that that plant was never commercialized. It closed in the 1990s. It was an experimental breeder reactor. And the Canadian Nuclear Safety Organization recently said that, you know, they weren't sure that that model was appropriate. On recycling, we're talking small amounts of recycling, very small. You still have all that solid waste to deal with, which will be shipped, of course, at some point to some place in Ontario. But these reactors generate new waste we've never had to handle before, liquid radioactive waste. We don't know whether the Ontario storage facilities will be able to cope with it. And so there's lots of reasons to do the research, to explore your options, but to be open to the information that's coming from all sides. We need to do our very best critical thinking on this issue in order to save ratepayers money, if that's the case, or to risk another, you know, how many times have we been duped on these things? Maritime Iron and Joy and all those kinds of things.
Okay, I'll relinquish my time to MLA LeBlanc, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. President.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mrs. Comeau, for a great presentation. I'm going to be pretty short because I have to relinquish a couple of questions to my colleague. So we're talking about renewables, and so how can New Brunswick increase its use in renewables without driving up the price of electricity in the province?
Because it's the cheapest source of electricity today. Wind is winning bids at between 3 and 5 cents a kilowatt hour in New England and in Canada. And so there's just no comparison in terms of so many of the other options on the table. Yes, you need to have your issues of reliability and what they call ancillary services taken care of. But the interconnects, this is why being interconnected in terms of New England and the Atlantic is so important, because it provides that stability. But definitely the debate we're having is about the different perspectives on what's the most affordable electricity system for New Brunswickers. I'd also point out we can have higher rates but lower bills, and that's really the goal. People should not be paying more for electricity because they're using so much less of it.
Thank you. I relinquish my question to Madame Landry.
Madame Landry, vous avez à propos de 30 secondes.
Oui, merci. It won't be long. A lot of people and presenters have talked about transparency planning and reports that we haven't seen. Madame Comeau, can you send us a copy or a list of reports that we should be made aware so that we can certainly look at them to discuss further?
Yes, I put all of those reports that I found from the progress report and the carbon pricing announcements on page, let me just get it for you. It's on slide 14. So those are all the reports that I found so far.
But they're not public.
The ones that have been completed are not public, and the second bullet explains all the ones that are going to be done, and we're asking that those also be public. At minimum, the committee should have them.
Thank you.
Hey, merci. Mr. Kuhn, you now have the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. So I want to start with buildings. So what the Climate Secretariat explained to us was that about 25% of our overall carbon pollution is accounted for by buildings when you consider the direct use of carbon-based fuels in homes and other buildings, and when you bring in that component of carbon emissions from generating electricity to supply those very same homes and commercial buildings. So 25% is pretty big. I don't hear the same sort of enthusiasm for on the part of governments for providing incentives to get us to net zero energy homes and buildings as I do for electric vehicles. There's a lot of talk, and there's now incentives for electric vehicles to replace conventional vehicles, but I don't see that happening to get us to net zero energy buildings. Can you give your views on that?
Sure, thank you. So obviously buildings have a couple of dimensions to them. The ones we're building, we want them to be as energy efficient as possible. So we need to adopt the building codes as they are released. We're like about 10 years behind if you're thinking about the 2015 one, and then the net zero codes for 2025. So we have a lot of preparation to do. Then we have to retrofit the buildings that we have. And absolutely, inefficient buildings are a waste of money, and we're not as comfortable when we're not in an energy efficient building. But the recommendation I'm making there is that we move from what I call more shallow retrofits to deeper retrofits so that we get real big savings. And that does mean a greater number of grants to be provided to help people finance that process. It may mean other innovative programming like we've seen in places like Nova Scotia. Eddie Oldfield will talk to you about PACE, I think. But it also means attending to the needs of low and moderate income households. Those in particular, we know that MB Power has been able to expand its low income programming. That's a fantastic thing. We now need to also have a grant system that is stepped down for higher income folks, but still provide support that we need. So absolutely an area for priority, and an area that carbon pricing revenue could be used for.
So with respect to studies you were talking about, is there a study out there in New Brunswick somewhere that's looked at what potential there is from an energy efficiency perspective in buildings in terms of cutting the energy waste, reducing the carbon footprint, and saving people money?
Absolutely. Phil Dunsky, who does do consulting work for MB Power, who did present to you last week, has done several of those studies, and you might want to just ask MB Power to share that with you.
Okay, so just to be clear, MB Power has those studies, so that's where we would go to get them.
It's at least one source. There's others, but it's certainly at least one source.
Okay. All right, thanks. And with respect to other studies, you mentioned a list of them that the Climate Change Secretariat has, and one of them was on climate neutral government. Did I hear you correctly?
That's what it says in the list in the progress report, yes.
Yeah, so that was a commitment under the Climate Action Plan and a recommendation of the Select Committee, which hasn't seen much implementation at all. Do you have some sense why these studies are not just automatically made available?
I don't. It may be a reason that's related to things like the Environmental Trust Fund. I don't know if the committee realizes just how many incredible pieces of research are done by the groups through the Environmental Trust Fund, but we never see them because they're not always translated, and it's an enormous task to translate them. So if it's public, it has to be translated. But I do think that when it comes to these studies, we should be making it a priority that everyone who works in the area can be the most informed and contribute the most positively.
Thanks. Can you say something about any work you've seen on the impacts of electric vehicles in terms of their potential in the near term in New Brunswick? What needs to be put in place and then what needs to be put in place to ensure that that is realized?
So let me just start on this one to say that we own an electric vehicle in our house. So I can share kind of the main experience. The first thing to say is the incentives are fundamental. We're a moderate income household, and we never could have afforded an electric vehicle without provincial and federal incentives. So that's the good thing. The second thing, though, is the minister talked last week about the sales of those vehicles being limited by production issues, but it's also limited by lack of information. So I don't know if committee knows, but there is a New Brunswick EV owners Facebook page, and there's about 1,000 people there, over 800 people. And if it wasn't for those people, we as a family would never have managed the transition to an electric vehicle. The dealership didn't provide information. They just weren't ready to help you figure out what kind of charger do you put in? Where do you find your electrician? If you're older, how is everybody who's going to have a car that's electric dealing with all the apps that we're being asked to download? We're just regular people. We don't really want an app for everything we do. But finally, the charging infrastructure is insecure. We charge at home. We have a level 2 charger. We're definitely saving money for sure on fuel costs. But when you're on the road and you have to charge elsewhere, every charger has its own card. You can't use credit cards and debit cards. Sometimes they don't work. So if we're going to really get the public into these vehicles, we have to make sure that the infrastructure is as simple and easy as it is today to go to the gas station.
Then on the climate change fund, have you looked at how effective climate change, the climate change fund receives the revenue from the carbon tax? Have you evaluated in terms of how effectively that's being invested in terms of the amount of carbon reductions it's achieving, or on the other side, the amount of risk it's reducing in terms of climate change adaptation?
So I guess a couple of things there. The carbon pricing money goes into 3 pots, right? We reduce excise tax on gasoline. We provide a tax cut. We, that's the decision of government. So there's an income tax cut, and then the rest, 36 million, goes into a pot. But most of that money, other than the EVs and some money transferred to SMRs and to MB Power, primarily goes to government departments to fund things they want to do. So the concern is, of course, that that's offsetting money that government should have spent on its own anyway, like certain infrastructure projects, and that the money isn't going to reductions in terms of community operations. Many of the investments, if you look at this year's list, is our studies. Getting ready, good preparation. Those are all important things to do. I don't have any denial there. But we do need to be rigorous about ensuring that we are investing in projects that are new and additional.
And then on the electricity strategy, we haven't heard anything, it feels like, in years on what's going on with the discussions among provinces and utilities for the Atlantic Loop. So where do you have any idea where that sits? Is it actually something that looks like it's moving forward, or, it's just, I think it's been 2 years since we've seen any kind of a progress report.
So there is something for committee members. It's called the Clean Power Pathway. It does include federal, provincial, and utility representation from the region. There are discussions and technical reports. It is like pulling teeth to get access to these reports. reports. There is the latest version that came out looking at the technical opportunities for the Atlantic in terms of phasing out carbon and connecting to hydro. It is a very important report, very positive in terms of its insights into what our opportunities are. And I would suggest the committee maybe ask to see that.
And who does the committee ask to see that kind of a report?
I suspect you could ask Minister Holland for it, yeah.
Well, I think he's right here, so.
Oh, he did come, Minister Holland, welcome.
I don't know, I haven't seen him, but maybe he's there. Anyway, okay, so thank you. One of the threads here is that there's a lot of work that's been done, but we're just not seeing it in terms of helping to inform at least MLAs about how best to move forward in New Brunswick, and that's even more opaque to the average citizen. So it seems like that's an issue. Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuhn. Mr. Austin, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Ms. Comeau for being here today and presenting to the committee. I'd like to just kind of follow up, and I had asked other presenters last week without any, they tried, but without any clear direction, especially as it relates to electric vehicles. And I know Mr. Kuhn was asking along those same lines, and I know you discussed about the lack of information and, kind of a drive, excuse the pun, but to go the route of electric vehicles. One of the biggest things, because I was actually kind of looking into it myself, and for me, what I find is hard to understand is the incentive in terms of maintenance and fuel savings. There's some talk out there that I've talked to different people, not experts by any means, but that would say, there's not a big difference between the cost of charging these vehicles versus the cost per liter of gas. Are you aware of any real-time information that's out there where you can say, look, cost per liter, per kilometer for gas versus cost per wattage, kilowatt hour, whatever it is per kilometer? Is there anything out there like that to give people an idea of what they're paying?
I have for you some real-time data from some of our colleagues who are more adept at this, who are on the EV Owners Facebook page, who did the calculations. And so at today's prices, we're talking about $10.25 per 100 kilometer in a gasoline vehicle. And the same cost is $2.09 for an electric vehicle. We see it on our bills. We do, you'll spend maybe $25 to $30 a month on your electricity for it, because we have a level 2 charger. But there's no comparison. I mean, we are saving money for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important. I do agree wholeheartedly that, if we're going to keep using these puns, but drive this into, people wanting to get into electric vehicles and getting away from, and for a lot of people, I mean, the environment is always there in their minds, but for a lot of people, it's the dollar at the end of the day, is how much can I save? What's the maintenance on these vehicles? How long do the batteries last? What's the replacement cost of these batteries? And to really have that information packaged to say, if you're looking to buy a vehicle, here's your traditional gas-powered engine, which are more fuel, better fuel economy and all of that, sure. But here's what you're looking at. Here's what you're looking at with an electric vehicle, how they operate in the winter, what's their heaters like. I mean, all of these sorts of things that I think there's just a lot of information that is lacking to really provide incentive. It's one thing for government to say, look, here's a financial incentive in terms of rebates, but here's some other incentives that you might want to look at that might sway you to electric vehicles. So just staying on that topic of electric vehicles, is there any concern in terms of environmental strategy as a whole? On the other side of the equation is a lot of concern about, again, the batteries and when they run out, where they go, how they're you know, how they're put in trash fills or wherever they go, electronic recycling. Can you maybe weigh in on that a little bit?
Absolutely. The issue of mining and the issue of materials, rare materials that we need in the batteries, speaks to the need for this more strategic thinking, right? It's not just about the vehicle. You want the vehicle running on clean electricity from solar, wind, and water, for example, so that you've got no emissions there. But we also need to think in terms of what we call a circular economy, meaning that that mining is done responsibly, that those are zero loop operations in terms of pollution at site, and that all materials are recycled and moved back into the system. So we're talking about quite an extensive transformation here that includes how the vehicles are produced, how they're operated, and then how they're disposed of. And that's very much the concern of many of us who work on climate policy, is that this get done properly, responsibly, and with the idea of a circular economy.
Staying on the same theme in terms of electric vehicles, is there sufficient charging stations throughout the province to make it viable for people that maybe do a lot of traveling interprovincial?
So a couple of perspectives there. The answer is no. The quick answer. And secondly, for me personally, as a policy person, I'm actually quite concerned that taxpayers are paying for the charging infrastructure. It's not clear to me why it's a responsibility of taxpayers. So, for example, it seems to me should be a private sector driven process. Every gas station should be retrofitted to be an electric charging system. And the upcoming clean fuel standard, which does require refineries to lower the greenhouse gas content of their fuel, does allow for credits to be traded, including if they invest in electric infrastructure and electrification of their processes. So what we need, I think, is it's okay for the public side of things to get things started, but I don't think we can pull it off as taxpayers. This has got to be something that becomes part of the economy. And I think if regulation's required, then we should look at that.
Okay, that's really all the questions I had in relation to your presentation. Again, I do appreciate your time and your input, and you certainly answered the electrical vehicle one very well. So I appreciate that, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving to the government members, you have 5 minutes. Minister Crosman.
5 minutes, sir?
Sorry, 10 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Comeau, for your great presentation today. We certainly can benefit from your 30 years experience in climate change. Every time you speak, I learn something new, and today is no exception. But I guess looking forward to, in the area of what we've heard, but also regarding education, because it's so important to educate our people, whether it's EVs or mitigation, adaptation, wind farms, and the rest. What suggestions do you have today that we can move ahead regarding education for our general public and others?
Minister, I'm so glad you asked that question. As an educator, I know you're going to care about this. So I do a lot of research in education and communications on climate change. And I can tell you, I guess, a couple of very, very important things. That we have what we call very weak mental models on the part of Canadians, meaning that they don't understand the link between what causes climate change, what the effects of climate change are, the solutions to climate change, or whether the solutions work. Because of that linkage being very weak, what happens is that the public doesn't know what policies to support. They don't know whether or not they can afford them. They don't know if they can work. So if you're looking at education, whether it's K-12 or post-secondary or the general public, which is really where I think we've been the weakest. And just so you know, I make this very same point to the federal environment minister too, that we need government to step in and to provide that ongoing education of the public. But in particular around the idea of what the solutions are, how they work, and why they're affordable. All of those kinds of elements need to be there. And I think we also need to engage the public more. So what happens when you're thinking about a transition, and as big as we are thinking about, if we don't bring Canadians and New Brunswickers into the conversation so they can participate and understand, then they're going to oppose it because they don't understand what's going on. So if we don't engage, educate, and include the public, we're going to end up in a situation where we can't build the Atlantic Loop. We can't build the wind turbines that we want. We can't do the work that we want to do. So I really strongly encourage the government to think about not just the Environmental Trust Fund projects. We do our very best, but also having government invest as well in educating the public and participation.
Thank you very much. I think you've answered most of that. But regarding the, how do you see the next key steps when you compare to other jurisdictions across the province, across Canada, maybe even around the world? You mentioned COP26, and how we move ahead in that way regarding education.
Okay,
Thoughts?
so yes, there is a network developing of educators. In fact, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment did create a working group to try to look at education. I've never seen anything come of it. I don't know where it sits right now, but it's something that can be pursued through that venue. I do know the federal government is proposing a public engagement strategy. There should be advertising that starts in the next couple of weeks. And it just so happens I have been asked to present to Environment Canada officials on how best to pursue education. So that's coming up in the next few weeks.
Oh, great. Good for you and good for us for having you involved. And just keep in mind as well that I don't forget, our door is always open. I know you deal with our staff on a regular basis, and certainly open to your input at any time. But also regarding what we heard from this today, you've covered a great deal. Are there a few small key areas of concern, not concern maybe, but that we can get across the finish line? This past, the plan had 118 items. We want to go with less if we can, and things that we can get done. Can you focus on 2 or 3 things, maybe even more?
Yep.
But,
Yep.
Go ahead.
I think if you establish a process to develop the electrification strategy for the province, the rest will come out of that, right? The process should deliver you your recommendations on what you would do in the various policies or legislation or whatever. So we need a process for electrification strategy. 2, I think I've mentioned like very deep concerns about the failure to protect health and safety by not investing in adaptation and hazards reduction. So whatever it is that we can do in the short term, we heard the presentation from Sussex, let's get those projects done. And then, the rest of it, again, in terms of governance, you have no choice. The federal government has about 10 different regulations coming your way. You're going to have to deal with
That's right.
that. So.
Okay, you mentioned 2. Is there another 1 or 2 you want to add to that? You mentioned your EV strategy for electricity
And the
health and safety. Yeah.
Well, reducing hazards. Within the accountability side of it, the recommendation is really to look at carbon pricing. What are we going to do as we respond to the new rules the federal government is imposing, the new pricing? Where's the revenue going to go? Can we do more to bring some of those investments through the carbon pricing money?
Right, and I think I add to that as well. I believe from my notes I've taken this past week and starting this week, everybody mentions mitigation adaptation is so important in moving ahead. There are a lot of great projects. You mentioned the Sussex area as being one. Everything you also mentioned, there's a great deal of cost, right, involved in everything. But we do want to get the best bang for our buck and mitigate where we can. Certainly make the adaptations and discussions from the shoreline last week to inland waterways for extreme storms. And no doubt this year we're getting more storms here in the southern part of the province and all of the province, I guess. But the freezing rain closed down the highways last night. And anyway, a lot of good projects on the go, a lot of good things being done. The Climate Change Fund, I guess we'll never have enough overall to cover all the projects in 1 year, but we'll certainly work on that. But I will pass over to my colleagues if anybody else has any questions to ask. And I want to thank you, Louise, again for your input. It's always appreciated. And we do appreciate your support for the EV program, and maybe just add to that as well, any best practices you can help us move ahead with a plan so others want to purchase or try to purchase, or and how they make things happen in their whole household and save money as well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Minister. Are there any other, Minister Johnson?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Ms. Comeau. I've got I'll throw you two questions in the interest of time, and then you can hit them both. One was, in the interest of balance, was there a reason why in your presentation you kept focusing on the Francophone perception? And then the second one is when you refer to us being 10 years behind whom?
Okay. Good stuff. I pointed out the Francophone perspectives, because they were somewhat stronger, if you will, in terms of the survey results, but also because, of course, the Francophone community is largely concentrated in the north. And a lot of what needs to happen in terms of Belden or the Green Energy Hub and so on affects the north. So I was trying to highlight for the committee the perspective of Francophones as well as Anglophones in that. In terms of the building code, we are, I always say to people, be more like Nova Scotia. And so most provinces adopt the building code sooner than New Brunswick does. So it's in comparison to other provinces.
Thank you.
Welcome.
That's all I had for questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair,
Minister.
I get follow up if no one else is ready.
Okay, Minister Crosman.
Yeah, just on a note regarding wind farms, up north is up at least twice this year, if not three times. Lamec has a great deal of wind farms. Some are coming this way soon to the Laurenville area you mentioned earlier. But not every location wants the wind farm. You mentioned, without getting into names here, not everybody wants them in their backyard, I guess. And
Yep.
we also need certainly the private business to take these projects on. There's lots down in Elbert County as well, in the Kings County now. And we certainly support these initiatives, and I guess most importantly too is, if people want it is one thing, but if they don't want it there, maybe a location, I guess. But I just want to add that part to it as well.
Yes,
Louise.
and to say we are doing a case study on what happened in the north. And again, I have family there, so I interviewed all sorts of people up there. And the opposition was not to wind itself, it was to the site. And so if we involve the public and let them participate in where projects go, we're going to do a lot better in terms of getting projects built.
And the public certainly was included. And maybe on a final note too, maybe the offshore, like most are inland, but maybe the Belden area might be a perfect opportunity as well. If we'll wait and see, I guess. But thanks again, Louise. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Comeau, thank you very much for appearing before us this morning. I'll give you an opportunity for any closing comments that you may wish to make.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, obviously, for such an enormous opportunity. We did provide you with additional information in the deck. Please reach out. I'm happy to meet with you anytime. And I know we're all motivated to do the best for New Brunswick, and I hope you take my comments in that light. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Too. I'll be watching.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay. Bye-bye.